Hey folks, welcome to another Triple T Thursday. For those just joining us, that's tools, tips, and talk, where we'll talk about info for the knife maker. In today's video, heat treating. All about heat treating. So buckle up folks, this one's gonna have a lot of key information. Let's take a look.
Okay, let's talk about heat treating. This is one of those really daunting subjects. When you first get into knife making, you read some of the forums and stuff, and people are talking about all these fancy terms, martensite, austenite, perlite. It's really confusing. So I figured I would put this together to help you guys understand these terms and what to do. So we want martensite. That's hardenable steel. And it's important to know these two terms. We're not talking about these martens. They're cool. Steel has a crystalline structure. Martensite is the state where steel is hardened, and of course that's the one we want, but we need to figure out how to get there. And austenite is the state of the steel right before you quench. So you need to reach these austenizing temperatures, and you're going to hear that term a lot. Austenite is the state of the steel before we quench. So austenite before martensite. Not to be confused with an Aston Martin. And a funny story, a friend of mine who's really into cars, whose last name is Martin, named his son Austin Martin. True story, folks. So this is always a debatable topic. Do I really need a heat treating oven? And I get that not everyone has an oven, and a lot of stuff I'm going to talk about later, especially when we get to my recipes, they're going to assume an oven, but forges are okay. The toughest part about a forge is managing accurate heat, okay, and managing it for a longer period. It's okay if you have a PID, which is a proportional integral derivative controller. Yes, I had to look that up. And that's basically a temperature gauge inside your forge where it will let you control the gas and the air mixture. They're kind of pricey, and by that point, you might as well just buy an oven, in my opinion. Unless there's other reasons you need to use a forge. Forge tips and tricks. So if you're going to be doing heat treating in a forge, there's a bunch of things you need to know. Everyone kind of gets this one, that magnetism effect, that steel loses its magnetic properties at around 1425. Now, most of the steels, or a lot of the steels that people are using, need to be quenched at 1475. So I hear a lot, I just need to go to non-magnetic and quench. Okay, you're 50 degrees off at that point. So you really need to go a little further. Another really important aspect here, steel loses its magnetism at 1425, but it doesn't gain it back until it goes under 500 degrees. So I see a lot of people, they'll heat up the steel in one part, and then, through, where they place it in the forge, it'll lose some of its, some of its heat, and then they'll keep testing it. I'm like, it's non-magnetic. Well, it still might be under the temperature because it doesn't gain its magnetism back. So be careful of this, folks. There's other ways here that are somewhat a little more accurate. In some chemical reactions, salt happens to melt at 1474, which is almost exactly where you want to quench a lot of steels, like the 10 series, 1080, 1095. So that's a really interesting one. I've never actually done that because I got my oven before I learned this. So some of you might want to try that out. Another popular one is to get a piece of steel pipe and put that in your forge and put your blade inside that. And that will help you regulate temperature quite a bit. So let's talk about the stages of working steel. There's a star beside the first two because even though you might not be doing them, they're being done to the steel. Right? Someone is forging the steel from the foundry, from the place that's turning it into bars. Someone's forging it, and then annealing it. So you might get it annealed, but this has already been done at some point. So most people, if you're just doing stock removal, you're going to start probably at number 3, maybe number 2, and of course, if you're forging, you're going to start at number 1. So heat treatment, when we say heat treating the steel, it really involves all 3 of these processes: normalizing, thermocycling, quenching, and tempering. And we'll get into each of those. Let's talk about annealing. So what this does is transforms the steel to its softest state. And this is what you want for grinding or things like that. So in order to do this, we're going to heat it to its austenizing temperature. So if it was 1095, for example, you would heat it to 1475. We turn off the forge or the oven, and we let it sit in there and cool slowly as the forge or the oven cools, usually 12 hours. Alternatively, if you want to keep using your forge or your oven, you can place this in a big bucket or steel canister of vermiculite and let it cool slowly. Why do we normalize and thermocycle? Relaxes the steel. So after the stresses of forging, hammering on it, it's kind of changed the crystalline structure in different places in the steel, and we want it homogeneous, meaning we want all the steel to be kind of the same crystal structure, okay, and a very fine crystal structure. And it will improve the grain structure, as we talk about. And you'll hear people say, oh, check out my grain structure, and they'll have a picture of a snapped blade. The picture on the right is a really good one that shows you the difference between these. The top one, where it looks kind of like sugar, as opposed to the very bottom one that looks more like flour. And the more normalizing, usually up to 3, after 3, you're losing any kind of benefit of doing a 4th or 5th. But if you normalize, you'll get a better grain structure. And this just means your blade is less likely to crack and to snap. Having a very coarse or large grain structure means your blade is inherently weaker because those crystal bonds are not as tight. So how do we normalize? So we're going to heat it above this austenizing temperature and let it cool in still air until it's black, until you can hold it with your hand. So the first, and this usually comes in 3s, the first temperature you're going to go beyond that austenizing temperature. And then you're going to go below the austenizing temperature. And 2 and 3 are typically, both below the austenizing temperature. So here's an example for 1095, which austenizes at 1475. You're going to normalize, or I normalize, at 1600, about 1450, and then 1250. If you're going to take anything away from this video, it's this slide. Okay? I see this all the time. I quench 1095 in canola oil. It works for me. That's one of those phrases that, I have a hate for. It works for me. It skated a file. Okay, that is the silliest things here. You need to use the oil that matches the speed of the steel, the quenching speed of the steel. Or otherwise, you don't know what's going on. 1095, 1080, the 10 series, W1, W2 require very fast quenching speeds. They need to be quenched in less than a second, meaning the temperature needs to be brought down from the austenizing temperature below 500 degrees in less than a second. So you need an oil that will quench it that fast. Other steels cannot be quenched fast. If they are, they will crack. 5160, 80 CRV, 52100, especially 01, they need a slower quenching oil. Something like Park's AAA or even canola. Okay, so if you quench something in oil that's not fast enough, you're not getting a hard enough blade. You're not getting what the steel can do. If you're quenching a steel in a quenching oil that's too fast, you're going to crack your blade, and even if you don't see them, you're going to have micro cracks in your blade. Okay, so guys, make sure you understand this, and that's why I have 2 kinds of oil. Soak time. This is another thing that you will have a problem with in a forge for things like 1095, that require a soak time. It's really hard in a forge to maintain a temperature for a certain amount of time. Like, you really have to fiddle with your forge to get it just right, so that you can have a steel stay at a temperature. Because usually it's going to try to keep heating up your steel. Obviously, this is easier, trivial in an oven. So how do we quench? So I'm going to talk mostly about oil quenching steels. We'll get into stainless later. But you need to preheat the oil. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but oil that's heated has more viscosity. It's thinner, and therefore it actually cools the steel quicker. So you do want to preheat your oil, and it's usually around 120 degrees depending on the oil in the steel. You're going to remove the blade from the forge or the oven, and you're going to plunge it directly into the oil, usually point first, and agitate it, meaning move it around. This will prevent bubbles and things from forming around the steel and kind of preventing more cooling. So you want to continually get fresh oil, so to speak, around your blade as you're moving it up and down. And you want to do up and down, not side to side. Side to side, you risk warping your blade. So Quench's do's and don'ts. Obviously, the first one is a simple one. Have a fire extinguisher ready, just in case something happens. You see people, the next one you see people on Forge and Fire do all the time. They'll quench, they leave it in the oil for 2 seconds, they pull it out, they skate a file, or they try to skate a file, and it's not hard. Well, guys, you didn't leave it in the oil long enough. And you hear the judges on this as well, and they'll constantly tell them, you got to let it cool. Even when you pull it out of the oil, it's still forming those crystals. You should leave it at least 30 seconds before you even try to do a file test on it, preferably a minute or two. Okay, be ready to correct small warps as soon as that thing comes out of the oil. The first thing I do is not to check for hardness. The first thing I do is check for warps. And be ready to temper immediately. Have all your stuff ready. You really should temper right after the quench. So what you shouldn't do, okay, you see this again on Forge and Fire and others, people creating a fireball because they're pulling something out of the oil and it's still hot. Okay, if you're creating a fireball, you didn't leave it in the oil long enough. Okay, testing too soon. We talked about this. You gotta let it get through that chemical change. Like the previous slide, using the wrong quenchant. Okay, use the right one. Obviously, don't drop the blade in the oil or on the floor. And the last one, don't put your blade on an anvil. Putting your blade on an anvil, which is cold steel, will make your blade warp. Okay, so either hang it, which is the best way, hang it from a hook and clamp it or something, or just try not to lie it down on anything. So let's talk about fixing a warp. Don't try to bend it back to straight after quenching. You're just going to snap it. Don't try to put it in a vise. You can do small changes, like maybe put a tiny bit of pressure on it, but don't put it in a vise and crank down on it. You're going to snap it. Do it slowly during temper cycles. Later on, when we get into temper, I'll show my 3-point straightening jig and how that works. Testing hardness. Yeah, like I says here, I'm really tired of seeing on Facebook, it skated a file. It worked for me. Okay, those files, like just a normal Nicholson, if it's even a Nicholson file, there may be around 62 HRC. So a lot of your steels, when they come out of the quench, are going to be around 65. So the fact that it skated a file doesn't really tell you anything. That might tell you that it's at about 60 coming out of the quench, which is not very good. At least use hardness files. Okay, and I've got a picture here of what the hardness files are. These are just files specifically for hardness, and they're in 5-point increments. So you can test with a 65, test with a 60, and the nice thing is you can feel the difference. And these are guaranteed to be those levels. The best, of course, is to get a hardness tester, and this is the next tool on my list. But they're really pricey. They go anywhere from $1,500 up to $7,000. So next is the temper. So why do we temper? So basically a quenched blade is going to be like glass. You drop it on the floor, it's going to shatter. We need to improve the toughness of that blade so it's not quite as brittle. But we still want to retain the edge, and we want to, have it still hard. So it's kind of a fine balance. The higher the temperature you do in the temper, the tougher your blade, but also you're going to lose more hardness. And these are usually not kind of a linear curve. And each of the steels typically will have a curve that shows you the different temperatures and what the hardness you can expect. So how do we do it? In a kitchen oven, a heat treating oven are both excellent ways typically. Toaster oven, you can use a toaster oven. You need to be careful because sometimes these things have a wild range in their temperatures. Even though you set it at 375, it could go from 325 up to 425. So you need to be careful on the toaster ovens. Make sure you preheat to temp before you put your blade in, because otherwise you've got especially on a toaster oven, you've got that burner right underneath that's cranking full blast. It's probably going to go over your temp. And usually everyone will recommend two-hour cycles at whatever temp you want. And guys, you can dunk it in water between temper cycles. You don't need to let it cool to black and still air. Just go dunk it in water. It's not going to hurt it. It's not going to crack it. Don't worry about it. And there's no such thing as over tempering. If you leave your knife in the oven accidentally and fall asleep overnight, it's fine, as long as it didn't go over its temp. Here, I use two things. When I temper, a lot of times I use these two pieces of angle iron that I've kind of put bolts in just to keep something straight, because sometimes things can warp during temper. So this is just insurance for me. I put the blades in this. And now fixing a warp with a 3-point straightening jig. So this is a picture of my jig where it's got these two things on the right side here are just little pins that I can move back and forth depending on the size of the knife or where I want to straighten. And the bolt just applies pressure from the opposite end. So it's pretty simple, and I can place this whole thing in the oven. I've done torch tempers, or it's not tempers, but torch straightening with these. So if you check out some of my videos, you'll see me use these. So, and like I've said in a previous slide, tighten slowly to remove a warp, then put it in the temper, cool it in water, and just keep going. It's pretty easy to take out a warp just with temperatures. So you hear people talk about color and torch tempering, and yeah, normally you want a straw color. If it's blue or purple, it's usually way too hot, but color alone is just not a good measure. There can be oil, especially after a quench. I don't typically clean mine completely after a quench, so there's oil and fingerprints and all kinds of stuff on it. So really, color is not a good measure, guys. And when people talk about a torch temper, especially on something that's really long, like a sword that you can't fit in an oven, this might be the only way to do it. It does take practice. It's really easy to screw it up. I've never really done a torch temper, but watch some videos on this. But it's not something I would do, given if I could fit something into an oven, I would do it that way. So let's talk about stainless steels. Also a question I see all the time. Can I use a forge for stainless steel? No, you cannot. They really need a zero oxygen environment. You really need a heat treating oven because you need to put the blade in stainless steel foil, and that gives it a zero oxygen environment. And then this thing about cryo or cryogenically freezing a knife. Basically what you're doing, you think of a quench, you're reducing the temperature of the steel. Well, we're just reducing it even more. So right after the quench, you're going to put it into either liquid nitrogen or dry ice, and you're going to leave it there for a couple hours. This may improve hardness, sometimes up to 3 HRC, depending on the steel and how it's done. Obviously, liquid nitrogen is really, really cold. You'll get 2/3 of the way there with dry ice, and you can do it in your home freezer. You will get some, despite what people say, you will get some effect from a freezer, but it's questionable. So I'll get in, I'll show my recipes. I'm not really going to talk through these, but you guys can pause them, look at them. This is what I use. Have a look, folks.
I hope you got something out of today's video, folks. Lots of important information about heat treating. So save it, bookmark it, share it, send it to your friends. Do whatever you do with important information. So thanks, folks. Join me for the next one. We'll see you soon.